Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It is so nice to be together again. How I missed you so. You're all three-dimensional. Although I will tell you that I've never received so many compliments on my appearance as I did when I was wearing a mask. So, not sure what that's about. Within just days of his death and resurrection, we read multiple accounts in the Gospels of where Jesus appears to his disciples. And so I think these stories we hear after Easter are so fundamental to our life as disciples. First, Jesus joined two distraught disciples on the road to Emmaus. Jesus changes the direction of these men who had been looking backwards with sadness. That is until Jesus reorients them to look to the future, underscoring his words with a dramatic act, the breaking of the bread. Jesus' second appearance was to Peter, an event captured in John's Gospel, which you will hear next week. But let me give you a little sneak peek. Jesus takes Peter aside to ask him 3 times, "Peter, do you love me?" And in that encounter, Jesus not only took away Peter's apprehension, but also gave him a sense of full forgiveness, of restoration, after his denial of Jesus on that final day, concluding with those powerful words of commission: "Feed my lambs, tend my sheep." But this morning, the risen Jesus finally appears in the midst of all the 11 disciples, bidding them peace and reassuring him that he is not simply some kind of ghost, but rather that he has been restored to life by the power of God. Now, just as an aside, every year on the Sunday after Easter, we read about Thomas. And I gotta be honest with you, poor Thomas. I mean, we just love to give this guy a hard time. For some reason, we beat up on Thomas for having doubts. It has become, sadly, the common theme in so many sermons. But truth be told, we should praise Thomas. First, for reinforcing the notion that doubts in our faith is okay. The reality is that Thomas let Jesus know what he needed for faith, and Jesus provided it. And so, while there are so many wonderful things to unpack and discuss with our friend Thomas, I'm not talking about Thomas this morning. I'm going to give Thomas a pass. And that's because, in all truth, as I reflected and thought about what I would say with all of you today, I could not help but have the last 2 years in that background in my mind. And as I read the gospel, there was actually another part of the gospel that jumped out at me. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear. Were locked for fear. The tomb is empty, Christ is risen, but my friends, uncertainty and fear abides. Let's be real clear about what's going on. The disciples are not gathering in this room to develop some master evangelism plan. They are not assembling a team or coming up with a task force or a committee or whatever to prioritize the needs of God's people. They're not drafting some comprehensive strategy about how to preach to all the world about the power of God. The tomb is empty. Christ is risen, but uncertainty and fear abides. The disciples are scared. They are on lockdown, hidden away, in fear of what may come. The same disciples that were with Jesus, witnessing the healings, witnessing the miracles, hearing his preaching, and some of the same disciples who just saw Jesus after the death and resurrection, with hearts burning, are locked up, hidden, looking inward. The disciples' initial response to the death of Jesus was total devastation. The response to the evidence pointing to his resurrection was disbelief, a persistent disbelief. The disciples are hiding behind closed doors, grieving in the safety of a hidden and sealed room, living in fear. Why does that bother me so much? Why did that text resonate? Because I think the most disturbing part of that text is that the same description could be said about us in the church today. After 2 years of living amid a pandemic, increased racial and social tensions, divisive politics, and a list of so much more, it would be so understandable. It would be so understandable for us to stay locked up, for us to live in disbelief, for us to live in fear. But I think these past years, we have been reminded that at times that we get more consumed about what is going on in our churches, in our institutions, our structures, and less about actually going out and proclaiming the gospel, especially to those who need to hear it, and actually to those who really need to experience it and feel it. The church is often more concerned about nurturing itself than it is with reaching out to the world. The church is often more concerned about its buildings, its budgets, its endowments, than we are at times with actually rescuing the lost. The church at times obsesses over organizational structures. The church often creates programs which at times removes us from the very world and the very community and the very people that we are called to enter and to proclaim the good news of salvation. And I'm sorry, and I know this is probably being recorded and watched, but that's okay. And often the church spends too many hours crafting resolutions, coming up with fancy words, rather than actually addressing the real issues, rather than going out and confront the very needs in our communities. The church can be caught up more in its own safety and security than it is about faith and obedience. We have often preoccupied ourselves with ourselves. So yes, we understand this. We can be like the disciples were at that time of unbelief, that time of uncertainty, that time of fear. Disciples then and the disciples now still struggle between disbelief and joy. And this last point is echoed so well in a concluding verse that is found at the end of Luke's account of this story. Bishop's privilege, I get to cherry pick a little. After they realized it was Jesus, Luke writes, while in their joy, they were disbelieving and still wondering. I love that line. while in their joy, they were disbelieving and still wondering. It's reassuring. The good news is that at the end, the disciples' fear turned into boldness. Confusion turned into conviction. Their troubled spirits turned to joy. And their floundering self-pity and grief turned into worship, into action. Then one more line at the end in Luke, which is not in our version this morning. After Jesus reminds the disciples of everything he taught them, reminds them that the words of the prophets have been fulfilled, that forgiveness of sins will be proclaimed in his name, he concludes with this: "You are witnesses of these things." Those words should jump right out at us. The disciples are to tell all that God has done. That in Jesus, a new way of being, a new world order has been established. That we are to love our neighbors as ourselves. These words are addressed to us here in this room. We are witnesses to these things. My brothers and sisters, we have work to do. In these last 2+ years, I have continued to be overwhelmed and inspired, despite all the setbacks, despite all the challenges, despite all the times I wanted to lock myself in a room. I have seen the way in which we have responded, and the way in which we are being witnesses of God's healing, of God's mercy. My friends, grace and love abounds in this diocese. Parish after parish is looking to find a way to focus on what is going on outside the upper room. And this parish is certainly no exception. We understand that while we love our churches, their history, their tradition, it is outside that we are asked to boldly venture into. The world needs good news now more than ever, and we have it. We must share it. We must live it. These last 2 years have taught us that we can do anything, and that we have everything. Let me be clear. We have everything we need to do the work of Jesus. We are a people of abundance. We are not a people of scarcity. All Easter stories begin with tears and confusion, but they end with hope. They end with purpose. The disciples were transformed. They were transformed from invisible to invincible. Disciples who bore witness to the saving grace of God in Jesus Christ and turned the world that day upside down. We too, today, gathered here in this space, in this town, we have that same opportunity. And we have the responsibility to bear witness to the world of a loving, liberating, and life-giving God. We are called to be transformed from invisible to invincible and to turn the world upside down.